On September 30th, 1946, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg formally declared the SS a criminal organization. That judgment made mere membership in the Waffen-SS a potential crime, although exceptions were established for those who had been forcibly conscripted after 1943 and had not directly participated in crimes. What followed was neither the absolute justice the victims demanded nor the total impunity many perpetrators expected. It was something more complicated and, in certain respects, more disturbing. Some commanders faced the gallows. Others escaped to South America with false passports and new names. Some rebuilt respectable careers in the Federal Republic of Germany, received government pensions, and died surrounded by their families. A few fought to the end in the streets of Berlin and were captured by the Red Army, sent to Soviet labor camps from which they never returned. The history of the Waffen-SS after 1945 is not the story of clean justice. It is the story of how a world trying to rebuild itself did not always have the will or the means to confront what had happened, and that history, with its contradictions, its silences, and its late revelations, still weighs on Europe's memory 80 years later. The first to suffer the consequences of defeat were those who surrendered to the Red Army, and their fate was by far the harshest. As the Eastern Front collapsed in the final weeks of the war, thousands of Waffen-SS soldiers were captured in combat on the roads during the retreat, or while attempting to cross Soviet lines disguised as civilians. The Soviets identified them with relative ease. Many members of the Waffen-SS had their blood type tattooed under their left arm, a standard practice of the organization. That small tattoo, useful on the battlefield to facilitate blood transfusions, became a mark of identification in Soviet detention centers. Removing it with a razor blade, as some attempted, left an equally revealing scar. Soviet treatment of Waffen-SS prisoners was not governed by the same standards applied to ordinary Wehrmacht prisoners, though they too were subjected to brutal conditions. According to estimates by the International Committee of the Red Cross, between 70,000 and 100,000 German prisoners died in Soviet labor camps between 1945 and 1950. The conditions reproduced with grim irony those the Nazis themselves had imposed on their victims: rations insufficient to sustain the required labor, diseases without adequate medical treatment, 12-hour workdays in extreme weather conditions, barracks without thermal insulation where men slept on wooden platforms without blankets during Siberian winters. Most of those who did not die in the early years were not released until the mid-1950s, after Stalin's death in 1953 and subsequent negotiations between the Federal Republic of Germany and the Soviet Union. The fate of the various national groups that had served under the SS runes depended largely on who captured them and on the political context of their countries of origin. Russians and Cossacks who had served in Waffen-SS formations, such as the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps, incorporated into the Waffen-SS in November 1944, were returned to the Soviet Union under the terms of the Yalta Agreements. Stalin had insisted that all Soviet citizens captured by the Western Allies be repatriated without conditions. In many cases, that repatriation was carried out by force, with prisoners literally resisting boarding the trains. Those who reached Soviet soil were treated as traitors. Many were executed immediately. The rest were sent to the Gulag. The situation of the Ukrainians of the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Ukrainian, known as the Galicia Division, was qualitatively different. This division had been formed in 1943 with volunteers from Galicia, the region of western Ukraine that had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1918. Many of its men fought under the conviction that they were fighting for the eventual independence of Ukraine, not for the German Reich. When the war ended, the Galicia Division surrendered in Austria to British forces. The Soviets demanded their repatriation. The International Red Cross, the Vatican, and the Polish army in exile intervened on their behalf, arguing that many of the men came from territories that before 1939 had belonged to Poland, not to the Soviet Union. The argument was accepted. They were not returned. After a period of internment in Italy, they were allowed to emigrate to the United Kingdom and, to a lesser extent, to Canada and Australia. In the zones controlled by Americans, British, and French, the situation was different but not devoid of hardship. Conditions in the improvised Allied prisoner-of-war camps during the months immediately following the capitulation were in many cases harsh. Millions of men were being processed simultaneously, and the infrastructure was overwhelmed. Many prisoners were held in open enclosures, struggling with disease, hunger, and total uncertainty about their future. The Allied authorities, faced with a mass of detainees that included everyone from high-ranking war criminals to 17-year-old conscripts, focused on identifying those of senior rank and those notoriously involved in specific crimes. The Denazification process, designed to determine each regime member's degree of individual culpability, was, in theory, meticulous. In 1946, the Allies established a classification into 5 categories: major offenders, Hauptschuldige, activists, Belastete, lesser offenders, Minderbelastete, nominal followers, Mitläufer, and exonerated persons, Entlastete. Denazification tribunals processed millions of people. But political pressure, court overload, the Cold War beginning to take shape on the horizon, and the Western Allies' interest in rebuilding Germany as a shield against communism progressively eroded the rigor of the process. By 1948, many cases had been dismissed, reduced, or resolved with minimal sentences. Rank-and-file soldiers who could demonstrate that they had been forcibly conscripted or had not directly participated in documented crimes were mostly released between 1946 and 1947. Upon leaving the camps, they found a country in ruins without employment and bearing the stigma of having belonged to an organization declared criminal. Many adopted silence as a survival strategy. They returned to destroyed cities, found work in construction or factories, and never mentioned to their families what they had done between 1939 and 1945. Their children did not ask, neither did their neighbors. Some were immediately recruited by the Allied powers for their own purposes. Western intelligence recognized the value of the knowledge and contacts of certain former SS officers in the context of the emerging Cold War. Reinhard Gehlen, the head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, surrendered to the Americans and offered his knowledge of the Soviet Union in exchange for protection. His network, called the Gehlen Organization, became an instrument of the CYA in Europe and the foundation of the future West German intelligence service. The BND Gehlen and many of his collaborators came from the Reich's security services. Though not all were formal members of the Waffen-SS, some had belonged to the SD, the SS security service. The question of pensions became the most visible battleground of the post-war era. The 1950 federal law on war victims' assistance, the Bundeswehrsorgungsgesetz, was designed to support disabled veterans and war widows. The debate over whether members of the Waffen-SS should receive benefits comparable to those of Wehrmacht soldiers was immediately controversial. The Allies had declared the SS a criminal organization, not a branch of the armed forces. Excluding them from benefits would have been consistent with that verdict. But doing so meant confronting a significant electoral bloc in a newly born democracy that needed stability. In 1953, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer publicly declared that the men of the Waffen-SS had fought as soldiers, just like others. That statement was partly the result of pressure from the veterans' lobby HYAG, partly a deliberate political calculation, and partly a reflection of a post-war culture that preferred forgetting to confrontation. In practice, it meant that many former SS members could claim limited pensions, especially those who could demonstrate that they had been conscripted after 1943 and were not volunteers. For Holocaust survivors, who in many cases did not receive comparable compensation for decades, that decision was a moral betrayal difficult to ignore. In 1956, when the Federal Republic formed the Bundeswehr, its new army, the question arose again. Could former SS members serve in uniform once more? In theory, the answer could be affirmative under certain conditions. In practice, of the 3,117 former Waffen-SS members who applied to join the new force, only 508 were accepted. The rest were rejected because of ideological backgrounds, criminal records, or pressure from Allied advisors who still supervised the German rearmament process. Those who entered the Bundeswehr generally remained silent about their past. In conversations with officers from other NATO nations, the subject was an unspoken taboo. The structural problem facing Allied prosecutors was scale. From an organization that at its peak had nearly 1 million members, with 38 divisions and an administrative structure spanning from the Führungshauptamt in Berlin to execution squads in Belarusian villages, it was humanly impossible to prosecute all those responsible. Priorities had to be set. The most notorious major war criminals, the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen, camp directors, those responsible for documented massacres, were the priority. Mid-level commanders could wait. Rank-and-file soldiers were generally not prosecuted unless there was specific testimony against them. The result was inevitably incomplete justice. The SS Totenkopf Division, responsible for guarding concentration camps from their inception and directly involved in the death marches, saw only a fraction of its members face legal consequences. The same was true for members of the Das Reich Division, whose history included the massacres of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane in June 1944. 99 killed in Toul, 642 in Oradour, including 247 children, and whose commander, Heinz Lammerding, lived until 1971 in West Germany, building a successful business career under the protection of a law that did not allow the extradition of German citizens. With the Viking Division, responsible for crimes in Ukraine, the situation was similar. In Yugoslavia, the approach was different. President Josip Broz Tito, aware that he needed to unite ethnic groups with histories of mutual violence during the war, adopted a pragmatic policy. Those who could be charged with specific crimes against Yugoslav citizens were prosecuted. The others were granted amnesty. This included former SS members from formations such as the 13th SS Mountain Division Handschar and the 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division Prinz Eugen. Many of the Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian volunteers who had fought under the runes returned to their communities, where the memory of the war and their loyalties was a complex matter that official policy preferred not to reopen. What remained from that process was a Germany that had condemned its worst criminals at Nuremberg, but had quietly reintegrated tens of thousands of accomplices into civilian life. A Europe that had judged the summit but left much of the base of the pyramid intact. And a generation of perpetrators that learned that silence was the best survival strategy in the world that was coming. The death marches, the last crime of the SS. Before the Allies reached the camps, the SS organized one of the cruelest episodes of the entire conflict. From January 1945 until the first days of May, more than 250,000 prisoners were forced to march on foot for days or weeks from camps in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Eastern Germany toward the interior of the Reich. The order came directly from Heinrich Himmler and the Joint High Command of the SS. The objective was to prevent concentration camp prisoners from being liberated by the Allies. For the regime, freeing the witnesses of genocide was a threat as serious as military defeat. The routes were long, inhumane, and deadly. The prisoners, skeletal from hunger, most of them sick, barely covered in rags and barefoot in the coldest climates, were forced to walk dozens of kilometers per day under the armed supervision of the Totenkopf units, the camp guards. Those who fell, those who stopped, those who could not continue were executed along the way without exception. Many times, local inhabitants watched the columns without intervening. Some tried to hand out bread or water, most closed their doors and lowered their shutters. One of the longest marches was the evacuation of the Auschwitz camp on January 18, 1945. 9 days before the arrival of the Red Army, more than 56,000 prisoners were forced to march westward. About 15,000 died in that operation alone, from the cold, from starvation, executed along the route. Those who survived were taken to camps such as Gross-Rosen, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen, where conditions were equally lethal. On April 13, 1945, near Gardelegen, SS soldiers and members of the local militia locked approximately 1,000 prisoners inside a barn and set it on fire. They died burned alive. When American troops arrived at the site days later, they found ashes and bones. In the Mauthausen March, which began on April 11th, thousands of prisoners from Gunskirchen and other subcamps walked for days along rural Austrian roads. Many died along the route. When the camp was liberated by American troops on May 5th, they found thousands of bodies and hundreds of survivors in a state of agony. At the Nuremberg trials, camp commanders and SS officers claimed they were following orders, feared reprisals, or were unaware. The evidence was overwhelming. The death marches were not accidents of chaos, but conscious decisions, systematic orders carried out by the SS hierarchy until the final days of the war. The Nuremberg trial, the condemnation of an organization. On September 29, 1947, the 9th of the 12 subsequent trials organized by the American authorities in the German occupation zone began in Nuremberg. 24 senior officers of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile death squads that had followed the German army during the invasion of the Soviet Union, were tried. Their purpose had been to exterminate Jews, communists, Roma, and anyone considered an enemy of the Reich. Between 1941 and 1943, these groups murdered over 1 million people without gas chambers, without crematoria, only with bullets. The most prominent of the accused was Otto Ohlendorf, head of Einsatzgruppe D, responsible for over 90,000 murders in southern Ukraine and Crimea. He was an educated man, an economist, a former official of the Reich Ministry of Economics. During the trial, he appeared cold, rational, and unperturbed. He did not deny the crimes. He justified them as necessary preventive measures for the security of the Reich. The evidence was overwhelming. Weekly reports sent by the commanders to the SS headquarters documented with academic precision the number of eliminated elements, as they called the human victims, classified by ethnicity, gender, and age. One of the most brutal documents was the Jaeger report, prepared by Commander Karl Jaeger of Einsatzkommando 3, which recorded the murder of 137,346 people between July and December 1941 in Lithuania. The document included every execution in detail. The sentence was handed down on April 10, 1948. Of the 24 accused, 14 were sentenced to death, 2 to life imprisonment, and the rest received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. Among those sentenced to death was Paul Blobel, directly responsible for the Babi Yar massacre, where over 33,000 people were killed in just 2 days in September 1941. Otto Ohlendorf was also among them. The executions were carried out on June 7, 1951, at Landsberg prison. Blobel asked for forgiveness before dying. Ohlendorf, however, maintained until the end that history would absolve him. He died convinced that he had acted correctly. The trial established fundamental precedents in international criminal law. War crimes could be prosecuted regardless of the rank of the accused. Obedience to orders was not a valid defense in cases of genocide. Individual criminal responsibility existed even within hierarchical military structures. Hunting the Great, fates of the SS leaders. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, architect of the most lethal extermination apparatus of the 20th century, tried in his last weeks to become Germany's savior. On April 21, 1945, he sent emissaries through Sweden to propose a separate peace to the British and Americans, leaving the war against the USSR active. Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross received the proposal. He forwarded it to London and Washington. The response was immediate rejection. When Hitler learned of the betrayal, he dismissed Himmler from all his positions by decree. The second most powerful man in the Reich for years was declared an enemy of the state. Himmler fled. He changed his uniform, disguised himself, grew a moustache, and covered one eye with a patch. He adopted the false name Heinrich Hitzinger and assumed the documentation of a Wehrmacht sergeant. On May 21, 1945, a group of British soldiers from the 2nd British Army was conducting routine identity checks near Bremerförde when they stopped 3 suspicious men. Their nervous behavior drew attention. One of them wore an eye patch. When taken to an interrogation center in Lüneburg, the doctors asked the suspect to undress and remove the patch. The eye was healthy. It was Himmler. He had no choice but to admit his identity. On May 23, 1945, during a medical examination while a doctor was checking his oral cavity, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule he had hidden between his molars. The British doctor's attempts to revive him were futile. He died within 15 minutes. His body was buried in an anonymous grave in the vicinity of Lüneburg. The exact location was kept secret by the British Army to prevent it from becoming a site of veneration. The fates of the camp commanders varied. Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz, initially escaped by assuming the identity of a laborer. On March 11, 1946, British troops captured him near Flensburg. During his trial in Poland, Höss testified that at least 2,500,000 victims were executed and exterminated at Auschwitz by gassing and burning, and at least another 500,000 succumbed to hunger and disease. On April 16, 1947, he was executed by hanging at the Auschwitz camp itself. Friedrich Jeckeln, responsible for the Babi Yar massacre and the shooting of 25,000 Jews in Rumbula, was captured by the Soviets. In January 1946, he appeared before a Soviet military tribunal in Riga, Latvia. He admitted his responsibility. On February 3, 1946, before a crowd of 4,000 spectators at Riga's Victory Square, he was hanged. Odilo Globoknik, the supervisor of Operation Reinhard, which resulted in the murder of between 1.5 and 2 million Jews and the construction of the extermination camps Bełżec, Sobibor and Treblinka, was discovered in the Alps by a British patrol in May 1945. When a British officer loudly pronounced his surname as a trap to identify him, Globoknik reflexively turned his head. Realizing what he had done, he tried to act as if nothing happened. It was too late. While being led to his cell, he bit a cyanide capsule. He died on the prison floor. Oskar Dirlewanger, commander of the brigade that bore his name, responsible for atrocities in Poland and Belarus that defy comprehension, was recognized by a former concentration camp prisoner on June 1, 1945. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Anton Fusing, who shared a cell with him, later described what he saw: open and bleeding wounds on Dirlewanger's face, his body covered with bruises. Every night he was dragged from his cell by Polish guards. On June 7, 1945, 6 days after his capture, the official record stated a heart attack. The truth was that he had died from beatings. Richard Glucks, who had overseen the vast network of concentration camps as successor to General Theodor Eicke and inspector of camps, was the one who proposed Auschwitz as a suitable site for a new camp in February 1940. On May 10, 1945, at the Murvik Naval Base in Flensburg, he swallowed a cyanide capsule. Otto Ohlendorf and Paul Blobel were executed on June 7, 1951, in Landsberg. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer tried at Nuremberg, who in 1942 assumed control of the Gestapo and concentration camp system after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, was sentenced to death. His last words on October 16, 1946 were, "I have loved my German people and my homeland with a warm heart. I have fulfilled my duty under the laws of my people and feel that this time my people were led by men who were not soldiers, and that crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge." The fate of Hans Kammler, the SS general who oversaw the construction of concentration camps and directed the V-2 missile program, remains one of the most debated post-war mysteries. His last confirmed appearance was on April 17, 1945. His family requested that he be declared dead as of May 9th of that year. The Berlin-Charlottenburg District Court approved the request in September 1948. Some historians have suggested the possibility that Kammler negotiated protection with the Americans in exchange for his knowledge of missile technology, but there is no conclusive documentary evidence. Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, nicknamed Gestapo Müller, disappeared without a trace. His last confirmed appearance was on May 1, 1945, in Hitler's bunker. He was never captured. In 2013, a German historian claimed to have found evidence that Müller died in Berlin in 1945 and was buried in a mass grave, but the claim was disputed by other experts. The mystery remains. The Ratlines, the SS escape networks. The term Ratlines refers to the set of clandestine networks that between 1945 and the early 1950s transported thousands of Nazi war criminals, including hundreds of members of the Waffen-SS and the Reich security apparatus from Europe to South America, the Middle East, and to a lesser extent, Australia. It was not a single or centralized system, but a constellation of parallel structures that shared methods, infrastructure, and often the same intermediaries. The most important geographical starting point was Rome. In 1945 and 1946, the city was Europe's crossroads. It hosted tens of thousands of war-displaced persons without documentation, humanitarian organizations issuing papers without thorough verification, and a network of monasteries and convents offering shelter without asking questions. The presence of the Vatican added a layer of diplomatic and logistical immunity that no other European city could provide. The Austrian bishop Alois Hudal ran from the Pontificio Collegio Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, an operation he described in his 1976 memoirs as a humanitarian mission to save soldiers from the hatred of the victors. Hudal had published in 1937 a highly controversial book in which he tried to reconcile Catholicism with National Socialism, earning him a reprimand from the Vatican and exclusion from ecclesiastical power circles. In the post-war period, he found an opportunity for personal rehabilitation by leading an operation he presented as charitable. He provided letters of recommendation and logistical support to figures such as Franz Stangl, commander of the Sobibor and Treblinka extermination camps, where approximately 1,700,000 people were murdered. Stangl used documents from the International Committee of the Red Cross obtained with Hudal's help to travel to Syria in 1948 and from there to Brazil in 1951. He was captured in Sao Paulo in 1967, extradited to West Germany, and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1970. He died of a heart failure in prison in 1971. The role of the International Committee of the Red Cross deserves careful analysis, as it has been subject to misinterpretation. At that time, the ICRC issued travel documents called Reiseausweise, identity papers for displaced persons, to anyone presenting themselves as stateless or displaced. The procedure did not include background checks. The organization had no mechanisms to detect false identities nor access to the criminal files of the Allied powers. When in later years it was discovered that the ICRC had issued documents to Nazi war criminals, at least 8,000 people used these documents to emigrate to South America, the organization acknowledged the situation but rightly noted that its procedures had been exploited by networks operating outside its knowledge. This explanation is factually correct, but does not cover all cases, as some local ICRC officials had documented contacts with intermediaries of the escape networks. The second main structure was the network linked to SS Gruppenführer Karl Wolff and SS officers who had served in Italy. Wolff had been the supreme commander of the SS in Italy and the intermediary in secret negotiations with the US OSS that led to the early surrender in northern Italy in May 1945, the operation known as Sonnenaufgang or Dawn. This collaboration earned him preferential treatment from the Allies. He was not prosecuted at Nuremberg, although he was tried and sentenced in Germany in 1964 to 15 years in prison, reduced for good behavior and health, for his responsibility in the deportation of 300,000 Italian Jews. His network of contacts in northern Italy included industrialists, aristocrats, and clergy who facilitated the escape of numerous SS officers to Spain and South America. Franco's Spain was the second major transit corridor. Spanish neutrality during the war and the ideological affinity of the Franco regime with National Socialism created a favorable environment for discreetly hosting Nazi fugitives. Madrid was a city full of Germans in the post-war period, economic exiles, technicians recruited by Spanish companies, spies disguised as businessmen, and war criminals waiting for documentation to continue their journey. The Spanish police did not cooperate with Allied investigations into war criminals. Agents of the Political Social Brigade were ordered not to interfere in the affairs of the German community. Otto Skorzeny, the Waffen-SS officer famous for rescuing Mussolini at Gran Sasso in September 1943 and for commanding infiltration units in the Ardennes in December 1944 disguised in US uniforms, settled in Madrid in the early 1950s after escaping Allied custody in 1948. From Spain, he organized a network of contacts among former German officers, private security firms, and foreign intelligence services, including the Israeli Mossad, which, according to some testimonies, used his contacts in the Arab world. Skorzeny also collaborated in training Egyptian security forces under Nasser. He was never tried for crimes committed under his command and died in Madrid in 1975, the same year as Franco. Argentina was the primary final destination of Nazi emigration. Juan Domingo Perón's government maintained during the war a neutrality that concealed a marked sympathy for the Axis powers and in the post-war period adopted a policy of actively receiving European specialists, including German scientists, technicians, doctors, and military personnel, many with pasts that made them unacceptable in any other Western country. In 1946, Perón signed migration agreements with European organizations that facilitated mass emigration from Europe. Argentine archives, partially declassified in the 1990s, revealed that the Perón government was aware that war criminals were among the immigrants and, in some cases, actively facilitated their entry. Adolf Eichmann, responsible for the logistics of the Holocaust within the SS apparatus, entered Argentina in 1950 under the name Ricardo Clement, using a passport issued by the ICRC in Geneva. He settled in the Buenos Aires suburb of San Fernando, where he worked in various industrial companies. He was known in his community as a quiet German with a family. His presence in Argentina was reported to the Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service, by Lothar Hermann, a Dachau survivor living in Buenos Aires whose daughter had dated Eichmann's son. The Mossad organized Operation Garibaldi under agent Rafi Eitan. 11 Israeli agents traveled to Buenos Aires, studied Eichmann's movements for weeks, and captured him on May 11, 1960 at the bus stop on Garibaldi Street. He was kept sedated in a safe house for 9 days while the evacuation was prepared. On May 20, 1960, he left Argentina aboard an El Al flight disguised as a crew member with false documentation. He was tried in Jerusalem before the district court starting April 11, 1961. The trial, presided over by Judge Moshe Landau, lasted 4 months and was followed by 100 accredited correspondents from around the world, marking the first televised trial in Israel's history. Philosopher Hannah Arendt covered it for The New Yorker and developed from her observations the concept of the banality of evil. Eichmann was found guilty of crimes against humanity and war crimes on December 11, 1961, sentenced to death on December 15, and executed by hanging on June 1, 1962 at Ramla prison. It is the only judicial execution ever carried out by Israel. Josef Mengele, the SS doctor at Auschwitz-Birkenau, responsible for selections on the arrival platform and experiments on live detainees, including injecting chemicals into children's eyes to attempt to change their color, performing amputations without anesthesia, and conducting experiments on twins, fled Auschwitz on January 17, 1945, 3 days before the camp's evacuation, carrying his research files. He spent the following months in various locations in Germany, was briefly captured by the Allies without being identified, released, and arrived in Argentina in 1949 using the name Helmut Gregor with ICRC documentation. He obtained Argentine citizenship in 1956 under his real name. When Eichmann's capture made clear that the Mossad was operating in Argentina, Mengele first fled to Paraguay, where he also obtained citizenship, and then to Brazil, where he lived under the protection of a German family in Embu das Artes, near Sao Paulo. He drowned on February 7, 1979 at Bertioga Beach, Brazil, after suffering a stroke while swimming. His remains were identified in 1992 through DNA analysis compared with samples from his son Rolf. He was never captured or tried. Germany did not publish its arrest warrant until 1959, 14 years after the war ended. Klaus Barbie was the head of the Gestapo in Lyon from November 1942 to August 1944, nicknamed the Butcher of Lyon for his personal responsibility in torturing and deporting thousands of people, including the arrest and deportation of 44 Jewish children from the Isieux colony on April 6, 1944. All were murdered at Auschwitz. Barbie was also responsible for capturing and torturing resistance leader Jean Moulin, who died under torture in July 1943. At the end of the war, Barbie was recruited by the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, CYC, which employed him from 1947 to 1951 as an informant on communist networks in Europe. When the CIC learned in 1950 that the French were seeking him for war crimes, it facilitated his escape. CIC agents put him in contact with Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganovic, who acted as a Hudal network intermediary and was director of the Pontifical College of St. Jerome in Rome. Draganovic arranged his ICRC passport and Bolivian visa. Barbie arrived in Bolivia in 1951 under the name Klaus Altmann and worked for years as a timber and machinery dealer. In 1971, he was identified in La Paz by journalist Ladislas de Hoyos and French researcher Beate Klarsfeld. Bolivia expelled him in 1983, and he was transferred to France, where he was tried for crimes against humanity. Sentenced to life imprisonment in 1987, he died in prison in Lyon in 1991. The existence of a single organization called Odessa, Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, Organization of Former SS Members, requires historical precision. The concept was popularized by Frederick Forsyth's novel The Odessa File, 1972. and by Simon Wiesenthal's journalism, but subsequent historical research has nuanced its existence. There is no documentary evidence of a central organization with that name operating as a unified network under hierarchical command. What did exist were multiple parallel networks, some informally coordinated, sharing infrastructure, contacts, and methods. Some historians, including Uki Goni in his work The Real Odessa, 2002, have identified specific networks in Argentina with sufficient documentary rigor to establish that the Argentine state actively, not just passively, collaborated in hosting war criminals. The distinction is significant. It is not the same for a government to look the other way as for one to send diplomats to Europe to recruit emigrants with criminal pasts. Simon Wiesenthal, a survivor of the Mauthausen concentration camp, founded the Jewish Documentation Center in Vienna in 1947. For decades, he collected testimonies, tracked documents, and provided information to prosecutors in multiple countries. His methodology was not archival research, but gathering testimonies and leads, which earned him both admiration and criticism from academic historians. He himself acknowledged errors in some cases, but his contribution to keeping pressure on European governments to pursue war criminals was irreplaceable during decades when the political will to do so was limited. Wiesenthal claimed to have helped locate and arrest more than 1,100 Nazi war criminals. The figure was disputed, but the general direction is indisputable. He died in Vienna in 2005 at the age of 96. HIAG, the Veterans Organization and the Rehabilitation of the Myth. In May 1951, in the town of Werden an der Aller in Lower Saxony, the founding meeting of the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, known by its acronym HIAG, was held. Founded by SS-Obergruppenführer and Waffen-SS General Paul Hauser, SS-Obergruppenführer Otto Kumm, and SS-Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner, three of the most prominent commanders of the Waffen-SS during the war, the organization presented itself from the very beginning as a mutual aid association with an explicitly political mission to achieve the legal and social rehabilitation of Waffen-SS veterans, to equalize their legal status with that of Wehrmacht veterans, and to secure their access to war pensions. Paul Hauser, aged 71 at the time of the founding, was the most visible face of this rehabilitation effort. He had commanded the 2nd SS Panzer Corps on the eastern and western fronts, was respected even by Wehrmacht officers, and enjoyed a reputation for military professionalism recognized by some Allied observers. For years, Hauser was the figure HIAG presented as proof that the Waffen-SS had been a professional army and not an ideological instrument. In 1953, he published the book Soldaten wie andere auch, Soldiers Like Any Other, which became the manifesto of the thesis portraying the Waffen-SS as a purely combat force detached from the regime's crimes. This thesis was historically unsustainable but was enthusiastically adopted by the political culture of West Germany in the 1950s, which needed to integrate millions of veterans into a new democracy without causing social upheaval. Starting in 1951, HIAG published the monthly magazine Der Freiwillige, The Volunteer, which continued for more than 4 decades. Its pages recounted battles in strictly military terms, published obituaries for fallen comrades, announced former division meetings, defended appeals in pension courts, and systematically constructed an alternative historical narrative to that developed by academic historians. By the time it ceased publication in 1992, the magazine had released over 500 issues. Articles authored by former SS officers described battles on the Eastern Front as Europe's struggle against Bolshevism, omitting any reference to massacres, deportations, and the systematic exploitation of occupied populations, which had been the other side of the same military operations. HIAG's associated publishing house, Mühlen Verlag of Osnabrück, published between 1954 and the late 1980s over 57 military history books on Waffen-SS divisions. These works, mostly written by former officers of the units they described, were distributed in German bookstores alongside conventional history books. Many were translated into English, French, and Spanish. Several sold tens of thousands of copies. Their methodology followed traditional military history, maps, orders of battle, operational chronologies. What they systematically omitted was any reference to crimes committed by the same units, the execution of prisoners of war, the killing of civilians, participation in deportations. The result was books that could be read from beginning to end without learning that the Das Reich Division had burned alive 642 civilians in Oradour-sur-Glane. HIAG's political strategy was equally systematic. Its representatives attended Bundestag parliamentary committees to testify on Waffen-SS service conditions and to advocate for the equalization of their pensions with those of Wehrmacht veterans. They financed lawyers to represent veterans in denazification courts. They supported the candidacies of conservative parliamentarians who defended the rehabilitation of veterans. In 1953, when Chancellor Adenauer stated that the men of the Waffen-SS had fought as soldiers like any other, HIAG celebrated it as a major political victory, although Adenauer took care not to repeat the statement in contexts where it could be directly challenged. The pension issue was the most concrete and directly affected veterans' daily lives. Under the 1950 Bundeswehrsorgungsgesetz, former Waffen-SS members were not automatically entitled to the combat pensions granted to Wehrmacht veterans. HIAG organized a massive legal campaign, case by case, to obtain recognition. Jurisprudence gradually evolved during the 1950s. German courts began granting pensions to former Waffen-SS members who could demonstrate they had been forcibly recruited after September 1943, when the Waffen-SS began incorporating conscripts instead of relying solely on volunteers, and who had not participated in activities declared criminal by the Allied tribunals. The result was an implicit classification. A volunteer from 1939 or 1940 was suspicious. A conscript from 1944 could be considered a victim of circumstances. This distinction, while having some legal logic, ignored that in 1944 the Waffen-SS was still carrying out the same reprisal operations and the same support functions for the terror apparatus as in 1940. In the Bundeswehr, formed in 1956, the question of the role of former Waffen-SS officers was handled cautiously. Wehrmacht General Adolf Heusinger, who had served as Chief of Operations of the OKH General Staff, became the first Inspector General of the Bundeswehr. The Allies had insisted that the new German armed forces should have a character different from the old army. An advisory committee called the Personalgutachterausschuss, Personnel Assessment Committee, individually reviewed the files of officers applying to join the Bundeswehr. Of the 3,117 former Waffen-SS members who applied, 508 were accepted. Rejection criteria included documented participation in war crimes, SS files showing membership in units specifically involved in crimes against civilians, and objections from Allied advisors. HIAG also maintained ambiguous relationships with the German far right. Some of its members were active in the Sozialistische Reichspartei, declared unconstitutional by the Federal Constitutional Court in 1952, or in the Deutsche Reichspartei. These connections generally remained discreet during the 1950s and 1960s, when the organization sought to project an image of respectability. In 1978, Der Spiegel published an extensive report that precisely documented HIAG's links with far-right parties, the presence at organizational meetings of individuals convicted of war crimes, and the apologetic nature of its historical publications. The report had real political impact. Several parliamentarians who had maintained discreet contacts with HIAG publicly cut ties. The organization responded that the article was defamatory but could not refute the documented facts. The 1980s were difficult for HIAG. The generation of its founders was aging. Paul Hauser died in 1972. Felix Steiner had died in 1966. The memory of the war receded, but at the same time academic historical research approached with more precise tools. Historian Bernd Wegner published in 1982 Hitler's Politische Soldaten, Die Waffen-SS, 1933 to 1945, systematically destroying with archival documentation the thesis of the Waffen-SS as an apolitical army. The work of historians, such as Christopher Browning on the police battalions and Martin Brosat on the administration of the concentration camp system, increasingly linked Waffen-SS military operations directly to the genocide apparatus. HIAG publications began to appear anachronistic even to some of its own members. The federal organization was dissolved in 1992. However, local groups of surviving veterans continued to meet informally for years. Some published memoirs and bulletins without HIAG's institutional support, but with the same apologetic bias. The last major documented gathering of former Waffen-SS members in Germany took place in Fallingbostel in 2005, with about 200 elderly participants. The SS, which had once assembled nearly 1 million men, ended as a group of elderly individuals refusing to acknowledge what they had done. HIAG's intellectual legacy survived the organization. Books published by Munin Verlag continue to circulate on the second-hand market and online. Some of them remain the only source of detailed information on minor battles on secondary fronts, and their purely military content is occasionally cited by academic historians with appropriate caution. But on online forums, militaria collecting groups, and certain far-right circles, these works circulate without critical caution. The narrative HIAG, built over 40 years, has found a new distribution vector on the internet that the organization could never have imagined. Late justice, the disputed memory. On November 11, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, the archives of the GDR and Eastern Europe were opened. These archives contained what the communist governments had collected over 4 decades: SS documents captured at the end of the war, records from the German occupation administrations, and testimonies from survivors gathered by prosecutors from the Soviet bloc. Access to these materials radically transformed historical research on the Waffen-SS. The most concrete example was the Central SS Archive in Berlin-Lichterfelde, which had been divided between East and West after the war. Western documents were held at the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz. Eastern documents were in the archive of the Ministry of State Security, the Stasi, in Berlin-Lichterfelde. Reunification allowed, for the first time, access to the full set of these documents. The personal files of SS officers who were still alive and receiving pensions could now be compared with operational records documenting their actual activities during the war. Fritz Bauer, Attorney General of Hesse, had initiated the first proceedings in 1958 to prosecute those responsible for the crimes at Auschwitz. Bauer, who had fled Germany after being arrested by the Nazis in 1933 and had lived in exile in Denmark and Sweden, returned to Germany after the war with the conviction that the German justice system had an obligation to prosecute its own criminals. He faced systematic resistance from the post-war judiciary, in which many judges and prosecutors had served under the Nazi regime. It was estimated that in the 1950s, 80% of the senior officials in the Ministry of Justice of North Rhine-Westphalia had been Nazi party members. Bauer succeeded in bringing the Auschwitz trial to Frankfurt between 1963 and 1965. 22 former SS members who had served at the camp were prosecuted. Of the 22, 6 were sentenced to life imprisonment. Others received sentences ranging from 3 to 14 years. The trial was the first to present the German public with direct testimony from Holocaust survivors. More than 360 witnesses testified. The cultural impact was enormous, especially on the younger generation, which had not experienced the war. The opening of Eastern European archives in the 1990s revealed the scale of crimes that had gone uninvestigated. The German Justice Coordination Center in Ludwigsburg, founded in 1958 to coordinate investigations into Nazi crimes, had worked for decades with incomplete access to documents. Now it could link names in SS files with operational records in Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Poland documenting specific massacres. The problem was that many of the perpetrators had died of old age. Those still alive were 70, 80, or older. In Italy, the process took even longer. The Sant'Anna di Stazzema massacre occurred on August 12, 1944, when the 2nd Battalion of the 35th Regiment of the SS Division Reichsführer SS, under the command of Major Walter Raeder, killed 560 civilians in the Tuscan village of Sant'Anna di Stazzema, including women, elderly, and children. The bodies were burned. In 1994 and 1995, Italian historians and military magistrate Marco De Paulis identified SS documents directly linking 10 surviving officers to the operation. The German government was notified. However, as in the case of Heinz Lammerding in Oradour, the Federal Republic of Germany refused to extradite its citizens, citing Article 16 of the Basic Law, which until 2000 prohibited the extradition of German citizens to foreign countries. An Italian military court in La Spezia tried the 10 accused in absentia and sentenced them to life imprisonment in 2005. Germany refused to enforce the sentences. The convicted died in their homes in German cities. The European Parliament adopted resolutions condemning this situation. In practice, nothing changed. The issue of pensions became a recurring political scandal in the 1990s and 2000s. Journalistic and academic investigations revealed that several former Waffen-SS members convicted of war crimes abroad were still receiving pensions from the German state. Arvid Fredriksson, a former member of the Nordland Division of Danish nationality, who had been convicted in Denmark for war crimes, collected a German war disability pension while serving his sentence in a Danish prison. Similar cases were documented in the 2000s involving members of Latvian and Estonian Waffen-SS divisions residing in Germany after emigrating at the end of the Cold War. The Bundestag debated multiple amendments to the Bundesversorgungsgesetz to exclude those convicted of war crimes. Some amendments were passed, others were not. The situation in the Baltic countries and Ukraine introduced a different dimension to the debate. In Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the memory of local Waffen-SS merged with the memory of resistance to Soviet occupation. The logic was understandable from the perspective of the victims of these occupations. If the Soviet Union was the main enemy and the Waffen-SS divisions had fought against the Soviet Union, these divisions could be presented as resistance forces even though they wore German uniforms and swore allegiance to Hitler. The 20th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division, 1st Estonian, and the 19th Grenadier Division, 2nd Latvian, became in Estonia and Latvia respectively subjects of official commemoration. In Riga, annual marches have been held since the early 2000s on March 16th, the date in 1944 when the two Latvian Waffen-SS divisions fought together for the first time. These marches have brought together former combatants, descendants, and occasionally members of European far-right parties. The European Parliament has criticized them in multiple resolutions. The Latvian government has responded that the context of Soviet occupation justifies the recognition of those who fought against it, regardless of the uniforms they wore. In Estonia, the Sinimäe Memorial in the Ida-Virumaa region honors soldiers of the Tannenberg Line, where in the summer of 1944 Waffen-SS units, including the 20th Estonian Division, fought for weeks against the Soviet advance. The battle was militarily significant, and losses on both sides were enormous. The memorial indiscriminately merges the memory of Estonian soldiers who fought on the German side with that of fighters from Estonian resistance forces of other affiliations. The real historical complexity, that many of these men also participated in anti-partisan operations involving massacres of civilians in occupied territories in the East, generally remains absent from official commemorations. Ukraine presented the most politically controversial case. The 14th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division, 1st Ukrainian, known as the Galicia Division, was symbolically reconstructed in Ukrainian historical discourse as an anti-Soviet resistance formation. In 2020, the Lviv Administrative Court of Appeals ruled that the symbols of the Galicia Division, including the emblem of a golden lion on a blue background, did not constitute Nazi symbols and could be publicly displayed. The Ukrainian government did not challenge the ruling. Holocaust historians noted that the Galicia Division participated in anti-partisan operations in Poland and Yugoslavia that resulted in civilian deaths, and that some of its members had previously served in auxiliary police units collaborating with the Einsatzgruppen in the massacres of Jews in 1941 to 1942. The debate between this historical assessment and the Ukrainian collective memory, exacerbated by the context of the war with Russia that began in 2014, remains unresolved. In Germany, Article 86a of the Criminal Code prohibits the public use of symbols of banned organizations, including the double sig rune used by the SS. The law has been applied in hundreds of cases since its enactment. In practice, collecting SS militaria, uniforms, decorations, documents, operates in a legal grey area where private possession is generally tolerated, but public display can be illegal depending on context and intent. Online, the distinction between collecting historical curiosity and active propaganda is impossible to maintain. The same forums where amateur historians discuss the history of a Waffen-SS division include participants using Nazi iconography as profile pictures. Academic research in the 1990s and 2000s definitively dismantled the thesis of the Waffen-SS as an apolitical army. Peter Longerich documented in his work Himmler 2008 the direct and integral participation of the Waffen-SS in the apparatus of genocide at all levels. Sonke Neitzel and Harold Welser published Soldaten in 2011, an analysis of secret recordings of conversations between German prisoners of war made by the Allies during the war. Soldiers, including Waffen-SS members, spoke about civilian killings and executions of prisoners with a normality that revealed how deeply this violence was integrated into their concept of war. Christoph Diekmann demonstrated in his study on Lithuania that the Waffen-SS provided between 25% and 30% of the personnel of the Einsatzgruppen in the initial months of the Eastern Campaign. Alexander Prusin's work on local SS auxiliaries in occupied Ukraine showed the extent of complicity networks surrounding the Waffen-SS in the occupied territories. The accumulation of this research over decades came too late for most perpetrators, but it produced a real change in German historical education, museum treatment of the period, and academic understanding of what the organization had been. Museums that in the 1950s displayed Waffen-SS divisions as examples of military bravery now, in the best cases, include sections dedicated to their crimes. The Berlin Holocaust Memorial, inaugurated in 2005, does not mention any Waffen-SS formation by name, but its existence and scale provide the best possible response to 40 years of publications by Munin Verlag. The Weight of Memory, Lessons and Warnings. Today, there are practically no veterans of the Waffen-SS left. Their associations have disappeared, yet their legacy persists in ways that remain relevant. In debates about historical memory and transitional justice, the history of the Waffen-SS after 1945 offers a complex lesson about the limits of institutional justice when faced with the scale of mass complicity. The Nuremberg tribunal condemned the leaders. Subsequent trials reached some mid-level commanders. But from an organization that at its peak numbered nearly 1 million men, the proportion of those who faced real legal consequences was small. The mechanisms of evasion were multiple: the escape networks that took criminals to South America and other destinations, the political pressure of veterans groups that influenced German parties, the logic of the Cold War, which led Western and Soviet powers to instrumentalize some ex-Nazis for their own intelligence purposes, the weight of economic pragmatism, which made reintegration a priority over accountability, and perhaps more enduring than any other mechanism, silence. The silence of the perpetrators about what they had done, the silence of families who did not ask, the silence of a society that preferred to look forward. That silence began to break in the 1960s with the Eichmann trial, in the 1970s with journalistic investigations into HIAG, in the 1980s with debates about the figure of the ordinary German soldier, and more profoundly after 1989, when archives were opened and a new generation of Germans began to ask questions that their parents and grandparents had avoided. The myth of the Waffen-SS soldier as a passionate but apolitical combatant, as a modern-day knight removed from the crimes of the regime, was deliberately constructed after the war by men who knew exactly what their role had been. That myth survived for decades because it was useful to those who wanted to reintegrate into post-war civilian life, to politicians seeking votes, and to a society that preferred the comfort of forgetting to the discomfort of memory. Modern historiography has systematically dismantled that myth. The Waffen-SS were not separate from the regime's crimes. They were an integral part of the Nazi genocidal apparatus, both at the front and in the rear. 1/3 of the members of the Einsatzgruppen had been recruited from the ranks of the Waffen-SS before the invasion of the Soviet Union. The construction of Auschwitz's gas chambers was overseen by the SS construction office. Around 7,000 members served as guards at that camp. 80 years later, the history of the Waffen-SS after 1945 remains a warning about what happens when a society allows the perpetrators of mass crimes to write their own history, and about the work required for honest memory once that history has already been written.